December 1944. High in the shadow of the Rocky Mountains, dawn rises cold and pale. Frost clings to the barbed wire of a sprawling camp near Trinidad, Colorado. Behind the wire, hundreds of German prisoners of war step out of wooden barracks, their breath rising in clouds against the sharp mountain air. They expect punishment, hunger, the iron taste of captivity. Instead, they hear laughter. The smell of fried eggs and bacon drifts through the camp. A radio crackles from a guard tower. Glenn Miller's swing tune rolls through the stillness. An American sergeant walks by, smiling, offering cigarettes. The guards are calm, unhurried, their rifles carried like formality, not threat. The prisoners watch in disbelief as steaming coffee is poured for them. They eat white bread, butter, and fruit, food they hadn't seen in years. One man murmurs under his breath, "So, this is how the enemy lives." Far beyond the Atlantic, men who once fought for Hitler now stand within a land of abundance and order. For them, this isn't defeat. It's confusion. America, it seems, lives like kings. By 1943, the war had turned against Germany. The once unstoppable Wehrmacht was bleeding on multiple fronts, beaten back in North Africa, driven from Sicily, and trapped deep within the Soviet snows. Entire divisions vanished in surrender. In Tunisia alone, more than 250,000 Axis troops were captured by the Allies. Germans, Italians, and a scattering of Romanians and Austrians. It was one of the largest mass capitulations of the entire war. For the United States, this sudden flood of prisoners posed a logistical nightmare. Europe was overcrowded and unstable. Britain's camps were overflowing, and front-line commanders needed space for new captives. The answer came from across the ocean, America itself. The U.S. had space, security, and above all, resources. So, between 1943 and 1945, over 400,000 German POWs were transported to the continental United States. They arrived quietly, under armed escort, through East Coast ports like Norfolk and New York, their uniforms stripped of insignia, but not of identity. Many had never imagined setting foot on American soil, yet here they were, crossing a country untouched by bombs. The trains rolled inland, through Kansas, Texas, and the Midwest, all the way to the open plains of Colorado. Camps were built in isolated areas, surrounded by mountains or farmland. They were not fortresses, but self-contained towns, barracks, kitchens, theaters, and workshops, all laid out with military precision. Camp Carson, near Colorado Springs, and Camp Trinidad, near the New Mexico border, became two of the most notable. Designed to house thousands of German enlisted men and officers, these sites were constructed in accordance with the Geneva Convention of 1929, which required humane treatment of prisoners. The Americans took this rule seriously, partly from moral conviction, partly from strategy. The U.S. Army recognized that every captured German soldier was also a psychological opportunity. Treating them well wasn't only about ethics, it was about influence. The contrast between Nazi propaganda and American reality could be more powerful than any leaflet dropped over Europe. Yet for the men arriving from the ruins of North Africa and Italy, that logic was unimaginable. They came expecting misery. Instead, they found clean bunks, organized work schedules, and guards who said, "Sir." Many were issued new clothes, medical care, and 3 hot meals a day. Life in Colorado was a strange mirror of the world they had lost. Disciplined, structured, but strangely peaceful. Some looked to the mountains and thought of Bavaria. Others stared at the abundance and wondered if this was a trick. For Germany, the war raged on. But here, beneath the blue American sky, the prisoners were about to live an entirely different war. One fought not with bullets, but with dignity, perception, and doubt. The first trains carrying German prisoners reached Colorado in the summer of 1943. The sight was surreal. Long lines of men in worn field-gray uniforms stepping down onto American soil, surrounded by guards whose demeanor was firm but polite. From the start, these camps were unlike anything they had imagined from Allied captivity. Many prisoners had been told that America was brutal, chaotic, and corrupt, a land ruled by Jews and capitalists, where prisoners would be starved or executed. Instead, They were greeted by discipline and routine. Camp officers explained the rules clearly: no violence, no escape attempts, and no disrespect toward guards. In return, the Americans promised order, medical care, and humane living conditions. That promise held. Each prisoner received 3 full meals a day, often far better than what American civilians on wartime rations could find in stores. Breakfasts of eggs, bacon, or oatmeal. Lunches with beef stew, bread, and coffee. Dinners that sometimes included vegetables, fruit, and dessert. The abundance stunned men who, only months before, had been starving in the deserts of North Africa or huddled in bombed-out trenches. Camp Carson and Camp Trinidad became the heart of the U.S. POW system in the Rocky Mountains. The air was dry, the land wide and quiet, perfect for isolation, yet strangely peaceful. From the outside, they looked like small military towns, rows of wooden barracks, watchtowers on the corners, and a perimeter fence that seemed more symbolic than hostile. Under the Geneva Convention, the Americans went further than required. Prisoners were allowed to organize their own councils, manage internal discipline, and even run small businesses within the camp. They could receive mail, read books, and attend religious services. Many were offered English lessons and vocational training to prepare for post-war life. Work became a key part of the arrangement. The U.S. faced a severe labor shortage. Millions of American men were overseas, and farms across the Midwest lacked workers. The War Department authorized POW labor under strict supervision. German soldiers harvested sugar beets, built roads, repaired machinery, and chopped timber. For every hour worked, they were paid in canteen coupons they could spend on cigarettes, candy, or stationery. These camps were more than prisons. They were controlled experiments in re-education. American authorities hoped that exposure to fairness, democracy, and abundance would soften Nazi ideology. To their surprise, it often did. At Camp Trinidad, some prisoners requested permission to stage plays and concerts. They built instruments from scrap wood, wrote satirical scripts, and performed in front of fellow inmates and American officers alike. Jazz music, once banned in Germany, echoed across the barracks. Newspapers circulated with translated articles about the Allied advance in Europe, offering a steady drip of reality against the propaganda they had grown up with. The Americans understood that this environment could do more than confine. It could transform. As one U.S. officer noted in a 1944 report, "They are learning about us without being taught." For many German soldiers, the greatest shock wasn't military defeat. It was the discovery that the enemy lived better, freer, and kinder than the world they had fought to defend. Soon, word began to spread among the prisoners. America was not the monster they had been told, and that realization was about to change everything, from their beliefs to the very definition of loyalty itself. For the German soldiers behind the wire, life in Colorado unfolded like a dream they couldn't fully trust. At first, they watched with suspicion, expecting hidden cruelty beneath the smiles. But days turned into weeks, and no brutality came. Instead, there were steady routines. Morning roll calls, clean uniforms, meals served on time. Some camps even allowed prisoners to cook their own dishes, using supplies from the American commissary. For men raised under totalitarian control, this sense of structure paired with freedom felt alien. Letters home often carried quiet astonishment. One prisoner wrote to his family in 1944, "We are treated like guests, not enemies." Another described his disbelief at the food portions: bread so white it looked unreal, butter in slabs, meat cooked until tender. For many, it was the first time they realized that the American way of life, even during war, meant abundance, comfort, and civility. Within months, tension eased. Guards and prisoners sometimes exchanged greetings, traded cigarettes, and even played soccer together. This wasn't propaganda, it was human contact. The Americans, secure in their victory and confident in their system, had no need to humiliate. To German eyes, that confidence looked like quiet power. The decision to build POW camps in the American interior was deliberate. Remote regions like Colorado, Kansas, and Wyoming offered natural isolation, hundreds of miles from the nearest border or coastline. Even if a prisoner escaped, survival across the open plains or desert would be nearly impossible. The climate was another factor. Colorado's thin, dry air mirrored parts of Europe's terrain, making the environment tolerable for long-term confinement. Local communities, too, benefited from the influx of construction jobs and federal funding tied to camp operations. Each facility followed a standardized blueprint, rectangular compounds surrounded by barbed wire, with 4 watchtowers and searchlights. Yet inside, the tone was remarkably civil. The U.S. Army military police were under strict orders. Lethal force was a last resort. Most guards were veterans recovering from wounds or older reservists, men who had seen enough of war to understand restraint. Security relied not on fear, but on routine. Escape attempts were rare. Most prisoners understood that even if they fled, the locals, who knew the landscape far better, would turn them in. Many Coloradans, in fact, grew used to seeing Germans in work details along the roads or fields, supervised but unchained. The line between prisoner and worker blurred. America had effectively neutralized its enemies, not through force, but through environment and psychology. As the war drained manpower, the U.S. government saw an opportunity in the thousands of able-bodied men behind the wire. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be put to work on non-military tasks, and so they were. German POWs became a hidden workforce across America's heartland. In Colorado alone, they helped harvest millions of pounds of sugar beets, built irrigation channels, repaired railways, and cut lumber in the San Isabel National Forest. Farmers, desperate for labor, often spoke highly of their discipline and efficiency. Each day's work earned prisoners small credits, which they spent on personal goods in camp canteens, soap, notebooks, tobacco. The system not only maintained order, but gave the men a sense of purpose. They were soldiers, but also craftsmen again. For rural Americans, the experience was equally strange. They had sent their sons to Europe to fight Germans, yet now Germans were helping them bring in the harvest. The paradox was never lost on anyone, but it bred an unusual mutual respect. In the quiet rhythm of labor and mountain wind, something subtle began to happen. The line separating enemy from human started to fade. By 1944, thousands of German POWs across Colorado had fallen into a steady, almost peaceful existence, one that contradicted every wartime belief they once held. Yet what came next would shake their convictions far more deeply: exposure to American culture itself. Inside those Colorado camps, the Americans did something no German officer would have believed possible. They allowed the prisoners to build a cultural life. There were libraries filled with English and German books, film screenings, and even small orchestras. The U.S. Army provided instruments, paints, and paper, encouraging creative expression as a form of discipline. At Camp Trinidad, prisoners built a theater entirely from scrap wood and performed operas, comedies, and political satires. Some of these plays mocked Hitler and the Nazi hierarchy, something unthinkable back home. For many prisoners, these performances became a strange education in freedom. There were no Gestapo agents watching, no risk of denunciation for a careless joke. They read American newspapers translated into German, discovering a press that criticized its own government, a shocking concept for men raised under propaganda. They also listened to radio programs, sometimes jazz, sometimes Roosevelt's speeches. Even those who didn't understand the words felt the rhythm, the openness, the self-assurance of a society unafraid of its own voice. To the outside world, these camps were just prisons, but to the men within, they were a mirror, showing what their own nation had lost. Art without control. Laughter without permission. The most powerful weapon the Americans used inside those barbed wire fences wasn't a gun, it was normalcy. By allowing German soldiers to live decently, think freely, and see the everyday life of America, the U.S. subtly dismantled the Nazi worldview. Propaganda had painted Americans as degenerate and weak, but what the prisoners saw was discipline, structure, and prosperity. Psychologists working with the War Department called it reorientation through experience. They believed that exposure to democratic life could rewire the thinking of captured soldiers. It wasn't indoctrination, it was contrast. At Camp Carson, officers observed this transformation firsthand. Soldiers who once shouted "Heil Hitler" now read English textbooks or wrote poetry about mountains and peace. Some volunteered for extra work, simply to feel useful. Still, not everyone accepted this quiet revolution. Among the prisoners, hardline Nazi loyalists, known as the Black Guards, tried to enforce ideological purity. They held secret meetings, punished dissenters, and spread rumors that kindness was just a trick before execution. Yet the evidence before everyone's eyes told a different story. The supposed enemy had given them warmth, respect, and dignity. Over time, the indoctrination cracked. Humanity, it seemed, was more infectious than hate. The treatment of German POWs in America stood in stark contrast to the cruelty unfolding elsewhere. On the Eastern Front, Soviet camps were synonymous with starvation and death. In Japanese captivity, Allied soldiers endured unimaginable brutality. The Americans, however, viewed moral strength as part of victory. To treat prisoners with dignity was not weakness. It was civilization asserting itself. Officials in Washington saw it as a chance to show the world that democracy could be merciful without being naive. Some critics within the U.S. questioned the generosity. Why feed and house the enemy so well? While Americans endured rationing, but military leaders argued that adherence to the Geneva Convention was both strategic and humane. It set a global standard, ensuring that captured American soldiers in Europe might receive better treatment in return. Beyond policy, it was a statement of values. The United States didn't need to imitate its enemies to defeat them. It could win by being itself, open, lawful, and human. For many Germans, that was the deepest shock of all. They had been told that morality was weakness. In Colorado, they saw it as strength. By late 1944, the experiment had changed hundreds of lives. And soon, as Christmas approached, those lessons would take on an unforgettable form, when American guards and German prisoners shared something no one expected in wartime: peace. December 24, 1944. Snow fell thick across southern Colorado, softening the fences and guard towers of Camp Trinidad until the whole camp looked more like a remote alpine village than a prison. Inside the barracks, the air smelled of pine, coffee, and bread. The prisoners, men who once marched under the swastika, were decorating Christmas trees built from branches gathered during work duty. The American officers had allowed it. In fact, they had delivered the pine boughs themselves. That night, the mess hall transformed into a hall of light. Candles flickered beside paper stars. A handmade banner read in German, "Frohe Weihnachten, Merry Christmas." On one side of the room, an American MP adjusted the radio antenna. On the other, a German sergeant tuned a battered accordion. When the first notes of Stille Nacht began, voices rose from both sides of the wire. Guards and prisoners sang together. No propaganda, no speeches, only the fragile sound of men remembering home. Some guards joined the meal afterward, sitting on opposite benches, sharing coffee, talking about their families, their farms, their winters. The atmosphere was not festive in the ordinary sense. It was solemn, reverent. Both sides knew that elsewhere, in Belgium, during the Battle of the Bulge, Germans and Americans were killing each other in the snow. But here, surrounded by mountains and silence, the war had paused. One American lieutenant later recalled, "They were enemies only on paper." That night, they were simply men far from home. The event was not officially sanctioned. It wasn't in the manual, but it happened, quietly, powerfully. For the German prisoners, the moment carried a deeper shock than any defeat on the battlefield. These were the same Americans whom their officers had called barbaric. Yet here they were, serving them food, singing their hymns, and treating them as equals on the holiest night of the year. Letters written afterward described disbelief and gratitude. One soldier confessed that the scene felt like a glimpse of peace in the middle of madness. Another admitted he had cried for the first time since Stalingrad. The camp's commandant later reported to Washington that discipline had improved, morale had steadied, and escape attempts had fallen to zero. Kindness, it seemed, had achieved what barbed wire never could. That Christmas night became a quiet legend in Colorado. For a few hours, the front lines of ideology dissolved under snow and candlelight, and for the first time, many German prisoners began to question not just the war, but the world they had believed in. The next months would reveal how deep that transformation went, because inside these camps, the U.S. military was preparing something even more remarkable, an organized effort to reshape the minds of captured Nazis, not through fear, but through freedom itself. By early 1945, the U.S. government had realized that the German prisoners were more than just captives. They were witnesses. What they saw, learned, and felt in America would echo across post-war Europe. That idea gave rise to a quiet, ambitious project, re-education through freedom. At several camps, including Camp Trinidad, Camp Carson, and others across the Midwest, the Army's Psychological Warfare Division launched programs designed not to indoctrinate, but to expose. The most famous of these became known as the Special Projects Division, nicknamed by prisoners as the Idea Factory. Here, selected POWs were shown films about democracy, workers' rights, and the Nuremberg trials of earlier centuries, lessons on justice and law. They attended discussions on literature, ethics, and the nature of truth. American officers didn't demand agreement. They simply presented contrast. The results were startling. Many younger soldiers, raised under Hitler Youth propaganda, began to ask questions they'd never dared voice before. They compared the order of Nazi Germany with the liberty of the United States and found their old beliefs hollow. One prisoner later recalled, "They gave us books instead of sermons, and somehow that made us think." Still, not all accepted the message. Within the barbed wire, ideological conflict erupted. Nazi loyalists, often veterans of elite units, organized resistance cells. They painted swastikas on walls, held secret tribunals, and in extreme cases, attacked fellow Germans who cooperated with Americans. Several murders were recorded across POW camps nationwide, proof that even in peace, war ideology survived. At Camp Trinidad, tensions reached a breaking point when re-education classes grew popular. Loyalists accused the participants of betrayal, calling them traitors to the fatherland. The American command responded not with violence, but with separation, isolating the radicals from moderates. It was an extraordinary decision. Instead of suppressing ideas, they divided them, allowing reform-minded prisoners to build their own cultural societies, newspapers, and councils. These groups began to publish German-language newsletters promoting democratic ideals, freedom of speech, and moral responsibility. Among the most famous of these papers was Der Ruf, The Call. Its essays, written by POWs, questioned authoritarianism and explored what a rebuilt Germany could become after the war. When repatriated years later, many of its editors, men like Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, became key voices in Germany's post-war literary and political renewal. The transformation was profound. In the same barracks where men once shouted slogans of conquest, they now debated philosophy and ethics. The camps had become classrooms. But behind this moral awakening lay another truth. America was winning not just on the battlefield, but in the realm of ideas. The humane treatment of prisoners was a living demonstration of democratic strength. It showed that a nation confident in its values didn't need to crush its enemies. It could convert them through decency. As winter turned to spring and the war in Europe neared its end, these camps stood as unlikely sanctuaries of reflection. Guards and prisoners alike sensed that something irreversible had happened. The old hatred no longer fit in this new, quiet world. And when news arrived in May 1945 that Germany had surrendered, the reaction inside Camp Trinidad was not celebration or despair. It was silence, heavy, uncertain, but strangely peaceful. For the men behind the wire, the war was over, but their understanding of it, and of themselves, had only just begun. May 1945. The guns in Europe finally fell silent. Hitler was dead. The Reich lay in ruin, and across the Atlantic, the German prisoners in Colorado awoke to a strange quiet, a world without orders, without a Führer, without a home to return to. News of surrender spread through Camp Trinidad slowly. Some men cheered, others wept. A few stared at the mountains in silence, realizing that the very nation they had fought for no longer existed. The war that had defined their youth had ended, but its meaning had evaporated. For the Americans, victory brought a new challenge: what to do with hundreds of thousands of prisoners who had lived peacefully within their borders for years. The War Department began the massive process of repatriation. Between mid-1945 and 1946, trains once again rolled east, this time carrying men who were no longer enemies, but students of a different way of life. At Camp Trinidad, farewells were emotional. Guards and prisoners shook hands, exchanged addresses, even photographs. Some Americans gave the departing Germans food parcels or small gifts: chocolate bars, tobacco, and books. It was not just a goodbye. It was the end of a peculiar friendship born from captivity. U.S. Army records describe the moment simply: departures proceeded with discipline and mutual respect. But behind those dry words were tears. Many of the guards had come to see the prisoners as men who, like themselves, were victims of circumstance, soldiers who had followed orders, not monsters. For the prisoners, the journey home was filled with uncertainty. Their country was a wasteland of bombed cities and divided politics. Some feared returning to Soviet-occupied zones, where repatriated soldiers were often imprisoned again. Others dreaded facing their families, haunted by guilt and loss. Yet many carried something new: a quiet admiration for America. Letters written after their return reveal astonishment not just at material comfort, but at the moral landscape they had witnessed. In America, one former POW wrote in 1946, "We saw how strength and kindness can live together." A few even confessed that they no longer recognized the Germany they had left. The propaganda that once shaped their beliefs had shattered under the simple weight of reality. Their captors had lived freer, eaten better, and laughed more than any Nazi promise ever offered. Some of these men, unable to forget what they had experienced, would later return, not as prisoners, but as immigrants. They became farmers, engineers, teachers, citizens of the same country that had once held them behind fences. Back in Colorado, the camps began to close one by one. The barracks were dismantled, the watchtowers taken down, the barbed wire rolled away. The land was reclaimed by grass and wind. Yet the memory lingered, among both Americans and Germans, of a time when decency had defied war. It was a quiet legacy, built not from battles, but from breakfast tables, handshakes, and songs shared across enemy lines. And while the world celebrated victory, in the calm heart of the Rocky Mountains, the last act of this unlikely story had only just begun. What those men would carry home, and how it would change the very soul of post-war Germany. When the German prisoners finally reached Europe, they returned not to the fatherland they had dreamed of, but to ruins. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were unrecognizable, flattened landscapes of smoke and silence. Families were scattered. The economy had collapsed. The soldiers who had once seen themselves as conquerors were now refugees in their own country. Sturihiru. Yet among them were men who carried something rare, a sense of perspective shaped thousands of miles away in a place called Colorado. These former POWs had seen a version of the enemy that defied everything they had been taught. And now, back home, they became quiet ambassadors of that experience. Many who had studied or worked inside the American camps began to share what they had learned. They spoke of democracy, of fair treatment, of freedom without fear. Their stories spread among neighbors, churches, and youth groups. It wasn't propaganda anymore. It was lived memory. Some of these men became voices of Germany's cultural and political rebirth. Writers like Alfred Andersch and Hans Werner Richter, once POWs in the United States, helped found the Group 47 literary movement, a circle of thinkers who shaped post-war German literature and democratic ideals. Their writings carried the quiet influence of what they had seen: decency as a weapon stronger than any ideology. Others found different ways to repay that debt. In the 1950s and 60s, a number of former POWs returned to America as immigrants, farmers, or exchange students. They wrote to their old guards, visited the remains of the camps, and stood before the Rockies again, not as prisoners, but as free men. In Colorado, traces of those years still remained. Locals remembered the polite enemy workers who harvested crops or built fences. Some families kept souvenirs, wooden toys, carvings, and paintings made by German hands. Decades later, those same objects would be displayed in museums, not as relics of war, but as symbols of reconciliation. The official records of the War Department listed the Colorado camps as logistical successes, orderly, efficient, compliant with the Geneva Convention. But history has judged them as something more profound, moral victories. They showed that even in total war, a nation could preserve its humanity. America had proven that kindness could serve strategy, and that decency could be a weapon of persuasion. While the world measured victory and destroyed cities and surrendered armies, the truest triumph was invisible, in the minds that changed behind the wire. By the late 1940s, nearly all the camps were gone. The sites returned to farmland, their fences swallowed by grass. Only faint outlines remained, a concrete slab here, a rusted nail there. Yet the story endured, passed down through letters, memoirs, and the memories of two generations who had once faced each other across barbed wire and found peace instead of vengeance. For many of those German prisoners, the United States became not just an enemy that defeated them, but a teacher that redefined them. They had lived in a land where the victors lived like kings, not because of their wealth, but because of their principle. And in a world struggling to recover from darkness, that lesson was worth more than any battlefield victory. History often remembers war through destruction, cities leveled, armies broken, and flags raised over ruin. Yet in the quiet valleys of Colorado, a different kind of victory was written, one without gunfire, one that spoke to the conscience of mankind. The story of the German prisoners in America is not about conquest, but civilization. When the world was consumed by brutality, the United States proved that strength did not have to come from cruelty. It could come from restraint, from fairness, from an unshakable belief in human dignity, even for the enemy. Behind the fences of Camp Trinidad and Camp Carson, the Americans displayed a form of moral power rarely seen in war. They didn't humiliate their captives. They educated them. They didn't starve them. They fed them. They didn't crush them. They let them think. And in doing so, they dismantled the foundations of tyranny more effectively than any bomb ever could. For the German prisoners, those years left a mark deeper than captivity. Many would later say that America's greatest weapon was not its tanks or planes, it was the way it lived. The abundance of food, the equality among men, the freedom of speech. These were things that no dictatorship could manufacture. Decades later, when some of those men returned to Colorado as old men, they stood in silence where the camps once stood, grass where the barracks had been, wind where the watchtowers once turned. Some wept, not from bitterness, but from gratitude, because in a world that had shown them every form of hatred, they had once found kindness from the very people they were told to hate. That was America's quiet triumph, a victory measured not in miles of territory, but in the hearts it changed. And as history turns its pages, the lesson remains. Even in war, humanity is the last and greatest weapon.